When the Beatles burst onto the scene in the early 1960s, they had a new, fresh, unique sound that was magnetic to so many listeners all around the world. They managed to do something with their music which very few other artists have managed to replicate in the same way. To take two distinct genres of music, combine them, and create something new. Particularly in their first era, the Red Album era, they would fuse influences from the world of white British pop and classical, different influences from black American blues and rock and roll, slam them together in the Beatles' Super Collider, and out came something new, fresh and exciting from those two styles combined. You could kind of view the Beatles' music on their first 5 albums particularly as existing on a kind of spectrum. On one side you have blues, rock and roll, and that raw clanging sound of electric guitars and drums, as exemplified by black American musicians like Chuck Berry, who the Beatles covered. And on the other side you have pop, classical and piano-driven styles like music hall, as exemplified by their producer and frequent collaborator, George Martin. It's just my theory, but I reckon you could plot every single Beatles song, from those first 5 albums especially, somewhere along that continuum. And when you look at how the albums were structured, how the songs were sequenced and chosen, you start to see a pattern. You start to see that each album looks like a kind of audio experiment. Every Beatles album, with its corresponding singles, looks like it could have been crafted to carefully include and combine elements from both those cultures, Black America and White Europe. But to explain what I actually mean by this, we need to dip into just a little bit of music theory. I'm going to keep it really simple, just so that I can explain the differences, musically speaking, between the far left of the scale, the blues, rock and roll, and the far right of the scale, the pop and the classical. And I'm going to do my very best to explain this in a way that makes sense to non-musicians as well as musicians. A cluster of notes all played together like this is called a chord. Of course, not all of them sound as nice as that one, some of them sound like this, but it's still a chord. Both of these musical styles or genres from each end of the spectrum, blues, rock and roll, classical and pop, each of them had their own palette of chords, their own selection of chords that you could choose and arrange to create the sound associated with that genre. Whether you were writing a blues song or a pop song, broadly speaking, you needed to draw from the correct set of chords to sing your song over. In the world of pop, on the very basic level, the chords you would use were the 7 basic chords, or diatonic chords, which were drawn from classical music. In the key of A on the guitar, those chords would be A, B minor, C sharp minor, D, E, F sharp minor, and G sharp diminished. For pop or very simple classical music, these were the chords you had available to write your songs with. Of course, in the 60s, when people were used to hearing much more complex music, songwriters also had many other techniques available to them. They would include things like key changes, non-diatonic chords and chord extensions, but for the purposes of this video, you don't really need to know about that. All you need to know is the skeleton underlying the music, and that is those 7 chords, in whichever key. For blues and rock and roll, however, the rules were different. Broadly speaking, generalising, you only had chords 1, 4 and 5 available to make blues or rock and roll songs, and the blues musicians who made those songs made little alterations to those chords called chord extensions. They added 1 extra note to each of those 3 chords to turn them into something called a dominant 7 chord. It has a much grittier, bluesier sound. So, instead of always playing a clean, happy sounding A major for chord 1, you would instead play this dirtier, grittier, slightly raunchier version of the chord, which is called A7. If you were a blues musician, and you'd do the same thing with chord 4, you would convert this, a happy, clean, normal D, to a D7. And here's chord 5 as it would normally sound, an E. But if you were a blues musician, you would convert that to E7. So, string those three chords together, a dominant 7-1 chord, a dominant 7-4 and a dominant 7-5, play it with a bit of attitude and swagger, and you get the blues. There were exceptions, but broadly speaking, blues musicians only used those three chords, a dominant 7-1, 4 and 5, and that was it. So now, hopefully, even if you don't really understand music theory, you get the vague idea. Blues and rock and roll used three main chords, which we will put here all the way to the left on the scale. Pop and basic classical used 7 different main chords, which we will put here all the way to the right of the scale. So now we are going to work through the Beatles' first 5 albums, bearing that scale in mind, and I'm going to reveal to you something really interesting. The Beatles did include many songs that were here all the way to the left, pure blues and rock and roll. They also included many songs that were here all the way to the right, pure pop classical. Many less well-known album tracks are scattered in between those 2 points, but it was here directly in the middle where I consider the true magic to have happened, where they created their new sound. It was here that they found a way to fuse rock and roll with pop classical. And they didn't just do this with production or arrangement techniques either. They did it right down in the fabric of the song, the chords and the melody. So, focusing in on the midpoint of this scale, number 3, I'm going to pick one song from each of the first 5 albums, singles and B-sides included, to demonstrate what they did and how they did it, how they created a new sound. So, let's make a start by looking at their first album, Please Please Me. Here is how I would map every track on this album along the blues pop scale that I've created here. On Please Please Me, we've got 3 songs all the way to the left. That's Boys, Love Me Do and Twist and Shout. Straightforward blues, just hitting those 3 basic chords, played in a straight up blues or rock and roll style. We've got Misery, Ask Me Why, P.S. I Love You, Do You Want to Know a Secret and A Taste of Honey in a much more dated, sentimental, classical influenced style. Very schmoozy old school pop. We've got plenty of 2s and 4s as well, but just one 3. And that's the really interesting one. That's the place where the Beatles' alchemy happens, right in the middle. According to my theory, you can plot every Beatles song in this album somewhere along this line, but the only one that lands right in the middle is track 1, I Saw Her Standing There. And that song does something fascinating. It's in the key of E, so here are the 7 basic chords you would play for a pop song in E. Here's the 3 dominant 7 chords you would play for a blues song in E. And here's what the Beatles did for much of I Saw Her Standing There. They merged them, so chords 1, 4 and 5 turned into blues chords, while chords 2, 3, 6 and 7 remained classical. So here's the first part of the verse to I Saw Her Standing There. It's in E, and we're going to be using the blues palette of chords for this section. And I've also bounced it down an octave, which means singing a lower version of it because I can't get near some of Paul McCartney's really high notes. Here we go. Well, she was just 17, and you know what I mean. And the way she looked was way beyond compare. But now, here's the next part of the verse, which doesn't use any of those chords. So how could I dance with another? Ooh. We've switched to the more standard pop chords there, and we've got a little pop curveball thrown in there as well, that's C. That's what you call a non-diatonic chord, that's a chord outside of the basic 7. And that pattern of starting out with the blues chords and then switching to these more pop classical chords continues in every single verse. So you can see we've actually got two palettes of chords there. Now, if you're not a musician, you might not realise how unusual that is in mainstream pop. The overwhelming majority pick one style and they stick with that palette of chords for the whole song. More creative artists might perhaps embrace loads of different genres in an album, so you'd have one song in this style, one song in that style. The Beatles did that as well. But blending two genres of chord palette right down in the structure of the song is much more unusual. Looking at Please Please Me, the majority of songs are kind of leaning towards 4s and 5s. We have quite a lot of sentimental, dated stuff. It's good, but a lot of it isn't really timeless, it is dated. So I would give this album an overall rating on the scale of 4.5. Let's go on now to look at album number 2, With the Beatles. Here's how I would rate each song from this album and its accompanying singles along that blues rock and roll to pop classical scale. Once again, we've got a bunch of fairly punchy blues rock and roll songs rated 1. We've also got the usual spread of sentimental, classical influenced pop songs rated 5. But by the second album, the band had actually reeled in the cheesiness just a little bit and started to favour a little more of the fresh, poppy edge of a 4 position. And yet again, there is only one song on this album right in the middle that I've rated 3. Just one that I consider to have fused both those styles, and that song is Hold Me Tight. Hold Me Tight blends blues and classical in a slightly different way. We've got these chords being played on guitar, F, then a B flat 7, then a G7, and then a C or maybe a C7. Now that sequence itself is kind of blended. It's partially blues and partially pop classical, but George actually pushes it back towards the blues by repeatedly playing a riff that goes kind of like this. That is a blues riff. For the musicians among you, that's using the minor and the major third over the top to kind of force it into the blues genre. And so there, largely because of George's riff, we have a blues verse. But now, just as happened in I Saw Her Standing There, we transition in the second part of the verse from a much bluesier vibe into something that is clearly pop and classical inspired. So hold me tight tonight, it's you. The verses of this song follow the same basic principle as the verses to I Saw Her Standing There. We open up with a blues thing and then we go into a kind of pop classical thing. When it comes to giving With the Beatles an overall rating, it's kind of an album with two genres. This album is a 4.5 and a 1.5. It's got two different distinct genres on it. You could make it a 2-disc album. So I would rate this 1.5 and 4.5 on the scale. But now, let's move on to the Beatles' third album, the place that I consider them to have really started to hit their stride and find their sound. A Hard Day's Night. Here's my rating for each song on the album, and you may notice that a pattern is starting to emerge here. By this point, it's as if the Beatles were finding their sound. They've started to contract in a little bit and do a less wide breadth of genres and styles and started to focus in almost as if they're experimenting. They're trying to see which ones the public like the best. And on A Hard Day's Night, they really have started to withdraw from the extremes of that 1 to 5 scale. The moments on this album that are 5s, the pop classical stuff, it now doesn't sound quite so dated and cheesy, but has begun to acquire a bit more of a timeless sound. Track 3, John Lennon's If I Fell, being a prime example. And you'll also notice that on the album, they literally never once dip below a 3. Those 1s and 2s, the blues, the rock and roll covers are gone. But now, on A Hard Day's Night, we have a load more 3s. We have a load more songs that are embracing blues infused into classical pop. There was just one of them on album 1. There was just one of them on album 2. But now look at album 3. The really kind of schmaltzy cheeseball dated stuff was becoming less prevalent, and the blues rock and roll stuff was completely gone, in its pure form at least. However, they hadn't actually given up on their bluesy rock and roll roots, because they gathered up the 4 songs that typically might have been on the album and released all of them together as one big blues rock and roll single. On a previous album, Long Tall Sally, I Call Your Name, Slow Down and Matchbox all probably would have been on the album. But I think Hard Day's Night and the Long Tall Sally single represent the Beatles experimenting to find out which part of their sound the audience like best. I think on some level this album was market research. I think this was them questioning whether or not they should be moving away from that blues and rock and roll influenced stuff and moving into more pop, classical infused territory. They put all the 3s, 4s and 5s on the album and all the 1s and 2s on a single. In this era, I think the song Can't Buy Me Love is one of the most perfect illustrations of how the Beatles mashed up blues with pop classical. Here's how the song opens, using all chords from that standard pop classical palette. Can't buy me love, love, can't buy me love. And then, what do you think comes next? We of course go straight into a 12-bar blues. This is a 12-bar blues in C where he's singing I'll Buy You a Diamond Ring. Then to an F7, then back to a C7, G7, I mean that is just pure blues. So once again you can see that number 3 on the scale being illustrated, blues combined with pop classical. And Can't Buy Me Love might be one of, if not the most perfectly balanced Beatles songs in that regard. But now look at Hard Day's Night as a whole. What would be the overall rating for this album? I would say 3.5. We have the occasional moment of a 5, but mostly it's 3s and 4s. And looking at the 2 albums that came before, that is quite a departure, but looking back historically, it's one that massively paid off. Because of that early era, the album A Hard Day's Night is one of the most popular. So I've mentioned there that I think A Hard Day's Night and the Long Tall Sally single were some kind of experiment by the Beatles to kind of figure out which of their many sounds the public liked the best. I also think the next album, Beatles for Sale, was part 2 of that experiment. I think at this point they were kind of gathering data, so to speak. They released an album of all 3s, 4s and 5s, and I suspect there might have been a bit of a kickback from some of the traditionalists saying the Beatles have abandoned their rock and roll roots. So I kind of view this 4th album, Beatles for Sale, as a control, if you like. I view this album as them trying one last time the old style to see if it does better than A Hard Day's Night did. So let's have a look at the songs on the album and the single and see where, in my opinion, they sit on the scale. Beatles for Sale was the last album they ever did in their traditional style with that full spread of 1 to 5s. Isn't the contrast between this album and the one that preceded it pretty stark? A Hard Day's Night was all 3s and 4s and the occasional 5. They were really focusing in on that middle ground of pop with a little bit of blues rock and roll influence. On Beatles for Sale, they went back to their old style one last time doing 1s and 5s. And of course, it's just a theory, but I wonder if they did it just to find out which style the public liked best so they knew which one to pick going forward. And of course, anyone who knows the Beatles' history knows that A Hard Day's Night was the direction that tended to be the most popular. When you look at the ranking of the albums on Spotify, you can see that A Hard Day's Night way outranks with the Beatles and Beatles for Sale, both albums embracing that traditional style, the 1s and the 5s. I think on Beatles for Sale, they decided to have one last blast at including loads of full-blown rock and roll blues stuff and loads of full-blown cheesy crap. And of course, this was the last album they ever made in this way. From the point of the next album onwards, everything pretty much changed permanently in favour of the 3s, 4s and 5s. Though I love the Beatles, though I'm a massive Beatles nerd and fanatic, I've just been to see Paul McCartney live, Beatles for Sale has always felt like a little bit of an album of leftovers to me, with one or two exceptions. There was only one single song, in my view, in the whole of the fourth album era that was a 3. And, of course, that song was one of the really good ones. That was I Feel Fine, the one single that came out alongside the album. So here's the verse, all blues chords, as you'll see.
Baby's good to me, you know she's happy as can be, you know she said so. I'm in love with her and I feel fine.
And now here's the middle section that starts off using the pop classical palette and then switches back towards the end to the blues one.
I'm so glad that she's my little girl. She's so glad.
Here's the change.
She's telling all the world.
Back to the blues chords. Now let's look at Beatles for Sale as a whole. What rating would we give this album? For me, this would be a 5/1. Lots of 5s and lots of 1s. It has that same split feeling, that same little bit of incoherence that album number 2 has. With the Beatles and Beatles for Sale are kind of the same because they have two genres. They're both albums that haven't really picked a musical lane. And so, now we come to the last Beatles album I'm going to look at in this little study. Help. And to me, alongside A Hard Day's Night, this really is a perfect Beatles album. They have included 2 old school tracks on there, presumably to keep the diehards happy. We've got Act Naturally, which I would say is a 2, and Dizzy Miss Lizzy, which is a number 1 rock and roll cover. Almost everything else is a 4 or a 3 now. There is also still one moment of schmaltzy cheese in the B-side, Yes It Is, and also another, in my opinion, way underrated blues rock banger called I'm Down, which was also a B-side. But for me, Help represents the point at which the Beatles found their sweet spot for their sound. The focus is actually a little less on those number 3 blended sounds that I personally like. Here, they've homed right in on number 4. Really crisp, clean, edgy pop infused with classical. At this point, they seem to be trying to avoid being really sentimental or dated or cheesy. But now, let's take a quick look at my favourite 3 from this album. Ticket to Ride. On Ticket to Ride, where the band have started to move a little bit to the right of centre on that scale, they've started to move more towards the 4s. Now, instead of the verse being blues heavy, the verse is more pop classical heavy, and the middle sections are the parts that are now carrying the blues chords. So here's the verse for Ticket to Ride. The verse follows a really pretty little progression. You've got an A, and the vocals push that to an A7 at one point, B minor, E, F sharp, D and G. So just really standard stuff for the pop sound of the day. And here the blues part comes in the middle section, where instead of a regular D we go to a D7, and instead of a regular E we go to an E7.
I don't know why she's riding so high. She ought to think twice, she ought to do right by me before she gets to saying goodbye. She ought to think twice, she ought to do right by me.
And now let's look at Help. What overall rating would we give the album? For me, it's a clear 4. They had started with this super wide range of styles and genres, but by trial and error they'd condensed it down, doing away with anything that wasn't the most effective, until they found the perfect range, which I would say was from around 2.5 to around 4.5. And I reckon that if you look at the Beatles albums from Help onwards, you can see that they really had found their sound. They had found that sweet spot. There were albums where they started to experiment around and push out the genre brackets a bit more, but broadly speaking, I think that by this time they had found what worked the best, and from here onwards decided to home in on it, focus on it, and make it the main thing. And so we are now drawing to the end. I've picked 5 songs from the era of each of the first 5 Beatles albums. They were I Saw Her Standing There, Hold Me Tight, Can't Buy Me Love, I Feel Fine and Ticket to Ride. Each of those is a 3 on my blues to classical scale. Each of those songs, in my opinion, took from blues and classical, fused those two styles together and created a new sound, something we might call Beatlesque. Interestingly, however, you only have to look at today's listening figures on Spotify to see that the Beatles' most popular songs really are all 4s. Pristine pieces of classical infused pop magic presented with no pretension, cheesiness or excessive sentimentality. And I really believe that that's what they were kind of figuring out with their first 5 albums, and that they really landed in the sweet spot when they got to Help. But while those number 4 songs, those polished, edgy, non-cheesy pop classical hits are fantastic and they are the best loved, as not only a Beatles nerd but a music theory nerd, I do still have a massive soft spot for those 3s, those blues-infused pop songs that blended both styles to create something brilliant and genuinely new. So, if you're a songwriter, next time why not give this a go? If you're writing a song in the key of G, instead of using the usual 7 basic chords, why not have a go at writing a song with the Beatle chord mix? Or if your song's in D, here are the chords you could use in that key. And here's that same set of chords again, this time in the key of A. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know down in the comments which era of the Beatles sound you liked the best, whether it was the later psychedelic stuff, the early number 1s, the rock and rolls, or if you do like that kind of cheesy, schmaltzy stuff, the number 5s that I've been a bit hard on today. As always, remember, any criticism of the music is coming from my position as a massive superfan. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you next time.